In the heart of Lomani village, nestled between rolling green hills and whispering palm trees, lived a young girl named Sumira. She was the kind of girl whose presence lit up every corner she stepped into. Her skin glowed like the morning sun, and her eyes sparkled like amber honey. Her laughter was soft and melodic, and her voice, whenever she sang or spoke, made even the birds in the trees fall silent just to listen. People often said that the heavens had blessed her with a beauty that was rare and pure. But Sumira was more than just a beautiful face. She had a gentle spirit and a kind heart. She never saw herself as someone above others. While other girls her age were busy chasing admiration, Sumira spent her days helping her widowed mother, Mama Kwale, on their little farm. They didn't have much, but what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in love and togetherness. Sumira would wake up early to fetch water from the stream, tend to the crops, and sell vegetables at the market, always with a warm smile on her face. During the village festival, when drums echoed and dancers filled the square, Sumira would move with a grace that captivated every soul watching. Her feet danced like wind over grass, and her colourful attire swirled like petals in the breeze. People from nearby towns and even distant villages travelled just to catch a glimpse of her. Mothers whispered to their sons, hoping they would marry a girl like her. Fathers admired her respectfulness and good manners, often wishing their daughters would learn from her humility. Despite all the attention, Sumira remained simple. She never let the compliments get to her head. She greeted everyone equally, old or young, rich or poor. Children loved to run into her arms, and elders blessed her every time she passed by. The villagers called her the flower of Lomani, and many believed she was destined for greatness, maybe even royalty. Yet Sumira never thought of herself that way. Her joy came from helping her mother, planting flowers behind their home, and listening to the birds at dawn. Her dreams were small but peaceful. She didn't crave riches or fame. She only wanted a quiet, happy life. Little did she know, life had its own plans. In the blink of an eye, everything would change. The same people who praised her beauty would one day turn their backs. The same villagers who once adored her would soon whisper cruel words. But for now, Sumira's world was calm, bright, and full of promise. She was the pride of Lomani, untouched by sorrow, unaware that fate was already writing a different story for her, a story that would shake the very roots of the village and leave everyone speechless. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the air stood still, and the harmattan winds made everything dry and brittle. The sun had just set, and the sky turned a soft orange, as Sumira began preparing dinner for her and her mother. The firewood crackled under the pot, and the smell of boiling yam filled the small hut. Everything seemed peaceful, just like every other evening. But in a single moment, peace turned into chaos. A sudden gust of wind blew into the hut, and a small spark from the hearth leapt onto the dry thatched roof. Within seconds, the fire spread like a hungry beast, licking at the walls and ceiling with a terrifying roar. Sumira screamed for her mother as flames began to engulf their home. Her heart pounded as she tried to drag a few of their belongings to safety. Her mother's wrapper, a small box of keepsakes, their food basket. But the fire moved faster than she could. Smoke filled her lungs, making it hard to breathe. Her mother, Mama Kwale, stumbled outside coughing, tears running down her face. Sumira tried to follow, but as she turned to run, a piece of the burning roof collapsed behind her, trapping her inside the blazing heat. She fought through the smoke, shielding her face with her arms, pushing past the flames. The pain was unbearable, the heat scorching her skin, but somehow she made it out. The neighbors rushed in to throw buckets of water, but by the time the fire was finally put out, the hut was nothing more than a pile of ash and charred wood. Their entire life had burned away in a matter of minutes, but something far more painful remained. Sumira's injuries. Her face, once the pride of Lomani, had been badly burned. The smoothness of her skin was now replaced with dark patches, swollen ridges, and scars that would never fully fade. Her eyes, still filled with warmth, now sat beneath skin that no longer glowed. Her hands bore burns too, wrapped in cloth as she tried to hide them from the world. When she looked at herself in the mirror that one of the neighbors brought, she couldn't recognize the girl she used to be. The same girl who danced like the wind, who people admired, was now broken by fire. But even more painful than the scars was the way people started to look at her. The admiration in their eyes disappeared, replaced by pity, shock, and whispers. She could hear them, even when they thought she wasn't listening. They said she was so beautiful, they said. Now look at her. Some even claimed she had been cursed, that maybe the fire was punishment for something. No one saw the strength in her eyes anymore, only the scars on her face. The girl who was once the shining flower of the village was now a shadow in the eyes of the people. And just like that, in one cruel night, Sumira's life changed forever. The fire didn't just destroy her home, it burned away her place in the village, her identity, her confidence, and the way people treated her. What was once admiration turned into rejection. What was once praise became mockery. But what the world failed to see was that beneath those scars, the heart of Sumira still burned brighter than any flame. The morning after the fire, the village of Lumbani no longer felt like home to Sumira. The whispers began before the sun fully rose. People who once smiled warmly at her now turned their faces away. The same mouths that used to praise her beauty were now filled with cruel words. As she walked through the village with her head lowered, wrapped in a scarf to hide the burns on her face, she could feel the stares, cold, sharp, and unkind. "She looks like a cursed spirit now," one woman muttered loudly, not even bothering to lower her voice. Another hissed, "She should stay hidden. No one wants to see that face." The words pierced deeper than any wound. Children who used to run into her arms now screamed and hid behind their mothers. Friends who once danced and laughed with her now crossed the street when they saw her coming. It was as if the fire had not only burned her face, but also erased every good memory anyone had of her. Even worse was the pain that came from within her own family. Her aunt Nobika, who had rushed over the night of the fire with promises of support, turned cold the moment she saw Sumira's injuries in the daylight. Nobika's face twisted with disgust. "You bring shame to our family," she snapped, not even trying to hide her hatred. "I cannot have you staying in my house. People are already talking. What will they say about me?" Sumira stood silently, her burnt hands trembling, her heart heavy. She had hoped for comfort, for a warm place to rest and heal, but instead, she was thrown out like garbage. Nobika shoved a small bundle of old clothes into her arms and slammed the door behind her. Sumira stood alone on the dusty path, not knowing where to go. The house that once held laughter and family now rejected her like a stranger. From every corner of the village, the judgment grew louder. Some villagers said she must have done something terrible to deserve such a fate. Others claimed she brought bad luck and cursed energy with her presence. No one spoke of her kindness anymore. No one remembered how she used to help elders carry water, how she shared food with the hungry, or how she stayed up caring for sick children in the village. All they saw now were the marks on her face. She tried to be strong, tried to walk with dignity even though her heart was breaking. But the loneliness became unbearable. She would sit under the tree near the edge of the village, her eyes filled with silent tears, wondering how quickly love had turned into hatred, how admiration had turned into mockery. She was still the same Sumira inside, gentle, humble, kind, but no one cared about her heart anymore. All they saw was the pain on her skin. Sumira's world had completely changed. The village that once celebrated her now treated her like a ghost. Even her own blood rejected her, but deep within her, a quiet strength began to grow, a strength that would carry her through the darkest days ahead, even if no one believed in her anymore. With nowhere else to go, Sumira walked to the very edge of Lumbani village, where the forest met the fields, and the winds carried only the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird songs. There, surrounded by silence, she cleared a small space and built a tiny hut from mud, bamboo, and palm fronds. It was nothing like the warm home she once shared with her mother, but it was the only place where no one stared, whispered, or called her names. Her mother, Mama Kwale, had grown weaker day by day. The smoke from the fire had left her lungs damaged, and though Sumira tried to care for her with the few herbs she could find, the old woman's strength faded quickly. One cold morning, Sumira woke up to silence, and her mother's hand, cold and still. She buried her alone, with tears soaking the earth, the only witness to her grief being the trees around her. The one person who had loved her without judgment was now gone. Now, Sumira was truly alone. Days turned into weeks. Sumira learned to survive on her own. She planted herbs in small patches of soil and foraged wild roots and leaves. She gathered firewood and fetched water from a distant stream, often walking for hours under the hot sun. Her hands became rough, her body thin, but her spirit remained unbroken. She taught herself which plants could heal and which ones could harm. Slowly, her knowledge grew. and her small garden became her lifeline. But life in the village had not forgotten its cruelty. Children who wandered too close would scream and run away at the sight of her. Some even threw stones, yelling, "Witch! Cursed woman!" Traders at the market refused to sell her salt or grains. "Take your bad luck elsewhere," they sneered. She was no longer just a girl with scars. She was now a shadow, someone people feared and hated without reason. Still, Sumira did not grow bitter. She did not return their hatred. Instead, she found comfort in the silence of the forest. She would sit under the tall iroko trees, whispering her pain to the leaves and letting the breeze carry her sorrows away. Sometimes she sang softly, not for others, but for herself, a melody of hope, sorrow, and strength. The trees did not judge her. The birds still came close to listen. The earth, though hard, still held her up. Though her face had changed and the world had turned its back on her heart remained the same, gentle, brave, resilient. Each day she rose from her mat, each time she tended to her garden, each moment she smiled through her tears, was a small act of courage. No one saw her strength, but it was there, blooming quietly, like a flower in the wilderness. Sumira had become invisible to her people, but within the shadows of isolation, she discovered a deeper power, a strength that didn't come from beauty or praise, but from survival, from kindness in the face of cruelty, and from the fire inside her that no one could ever burn away. One hot afternoon, when the village lay still under the heavy sun, a tall traveler entered Lomani. His skin was deep and rich like polished mahogany, his eyes calm but alert, and his steps firm as though he had walked through many lands. His name was Sifo, a merchant from the distant region of Damera. He carried a small leather pouch and a simple walking staff, and though he looked like a wanderer, there was something noble in the way he moved. Sifo came with a purpose. He was searching for rare herbs to treat his sister, who had fallen gravely ill. The best healers in Damera had failed to help her, and someone had whispered to him about the powerful wild herbs that grew only near Lumbani. So, he made the long journey, hoping to find someone who could help him. When he asked the villagers where he could find the best herbalist, they laughed cruelly. "You want healing? Then go to the witch who lives near the forest," one man mocked. "Yes, the cursed woman with the burned face," another woman added, cackling. They spoke with such spite, as if they were warning him, not helping him. But Sifo was not a man who listened to gossip. His heart was not easily swayed by cruel words. Curious and determined, he followed the direction they had pointed, walking the narrow path that led to the edge of the village, where the trees grew thicker and the air felt quieter. There, in a modest hut surrounded by herbs and flowers, he saw her. Sumira stood barefoot in the garden, her hands gently tending to the plants. Her face, scarred and marked, turned toward him with surprise. For a moment, there was silence, but Sifo did not flinch. He did not look away. His eyes did not settle on the scars, but on the strength in her gaze, the calm in her presence. "I was told you know herbs," he said softly. Sumira nodded and welcomed him without hesitation. He explained his sister's illness, and she listened carefully. Then, she walked through her garden, picked specific leaves and roots, and began to grind them while speaking in a gentle, wise tone. She explained each herb, how it worked, what it cured, how to prepare it. Sifo watched her hands move with knowledge and grace. She wasn't just a woman who survived pain. She was a healer, a teacher, a soul full of quiet power. When she handed him the medicine, she looked up and said, "Tell your sister to take this with warm water at dawn and before sleep. It will help her breathe again." Sifo thanked her and left, but something inside him had shifted. The memory of her voice, her strength, her kindness, it stayed with him. A few days later he returned, not just for more herbs, but to see her again, and then again. Each visit brought deeper conversations. He spoke of his life in Damera, his dreams, his worries. She shared stories of the forest, of healing, of hope. Sifo no longer saw her as a healer or an outcast. He saw her heart, and it pulled him closer with every visit. As the days passed, Sifo's visits became more frequent, almost like the rising sun, steady and certain. What started as curiosity soon turned into companionship. He would sit with Sumira under the shade of the tall trees, their laughter blending with the rustling leaves. They talked for hours, sometimes about simple things, weather, herbs, stories from Damera, and sometimes about deeper wounds, unspoken pain, and silent dreams. Sifo listened to Sumira's story, the fire, the rejection, the cruel words from the villagers, and the lonely nights. He looked at her, not with pity, but with admiration. "They don't deserve you," he would say gently. But Sumira would only smile softly and reply, "I don't need their approval. I live by the rhythm of the earth now. The trees don't judge. The winds still sing." With every conversation, Sifo felt more drawn to her, not just her wisdom and courage, but the peace she carried within her scars. Her presence was like medicine to his soul, calm and grounding. He began to bring her small gifts from the market, colorful beads, soft fabric from Demera, rare spices, and sometimes just a ripe fruit he thought she'd like. But more than anything, he brought his time, his attention, and his respect, something Sumira hadn't received from anyone in a long time. And Sumira, though surprised at first, found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She laughed again, not just politely, but deeply, from her heart. She started to hum her old harvest songs, the ones she used to sing before the fire. Sifo's presence was like light filtering through a dark forest, gentle but powerful, reaching parts of her soul she had kept hidden. One afternoon, as the sun began to set in golden waves across the fields, Sifo stood beside her small garden. He looked at Sumira, who was bent over a pot of herbs, her face glowing in the warm light, and his heart felt full. Without thinking twice, he dropped to one knee, right there among the scent of leaves and the chirping of birds. "Sumira," he said, his voice soft but sure, "will you marry me?" Sumira froze. Her hands trembled, and her eyes widened with disbelief. "Me?" she whispered. "With this face?" Sifo reached for her hands and held them gently. "I see your soul," he said, "and it is the most beautiful thing I've ever known. Your strength, your heart, your kindness. It's more than anything I've seen in any queen, any beauty, any jewel." Tears welled up in Sumira's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not since the fire, not since her world had turned against her. She didn't know whether to cry or smile, but in that moment, something inside her melted. A wall that had stood for too long finally crumbled. She didn't say yes immediately. Her heart needed to believe it wasn't a dream, but the look in Sifo's eyes told her this was real. He didn't see a scarred face. He saw the woman behind it, the healer, the fighter, the soul of Lomani, who had survived it all. And in that moment, the world felt different, softer, warmer. A love beyond appearance had taken root, and it was only just beginning to bloom. The moment the news broke, the whole village of Lomani erupted in laughter and disbelief. Gossip traveled faster than the wind. People gathered in small groups, whispering and chuckling behind cupped hands. "Did you hear?" one woman gasped, barely holding her laughter. "Sifo wants to marry that hideous girl, the one with the burned face." Another man scoffed. "He must be blind, or cursed. Who would want a scarred woman when there are plenty of beautiful girls around?" Children mimicked Sumira's limp and scars, while old women shook their heads in pity, or was it mockery? The once proud village that used to admire Sumira now ridiculed her with even more cruelty. The same people who used to praise her beauty now couldn't believe that someone would choose her for marriage. It was as if her scars had erased her humanity in their eyes. Even her own Aunt Nobika, who had once thrown her out of the house, came storming to Sifo's hut. Her face was full of rage and disbelief. "Have you lost your mind?" she shouted. "You'll regret this, Sifo. She's a disgrace to this village. Do you want your children to carry her cursed blood?" But Sifo didn't flinch. He looked Nobika in the eye and said calmly, "I see in Sumira what none of you ever cared to see. Her scars don't scare me. They remind me of her strength. I will not hide my love for her. I will marry her not in secret, but in front of everyone, with drums, dancers, and flowers." His words shocked everyone. No one had expected him to be so bold. Sumira, too, was stunned when she heard what he had declared. A part of her was scared. She didn't want to be humiliated again. But another part, the part that still dreamed, held on to hope. The wedding day came. The entire village gathered, not to bless the couple, but to witness what they thought would be a foolish spectacle. People dressed up not in celebration, but in curiosity. Some came just to laugh. Others wanted to see how far Sifo would go with this madness. Women sat with folded arms, gossiping under the baobab trees. Young men smirked and whispered among themselves. Even children made jokes, pointing towards Sumira's small hut at the forest's edge. They expected her to hide. They expected Sifo to change his mind. But neither of those things happened. Instead, from the edge of the village came the sound of soft drums. Then dancers appeared, followed by Sifo, dressed in the finest robes of Demera, holding his head high with pride, and beside him walked Sumira. Her face still bore the scars, but her eyes held courage, and her smile glowed like the morning sun. She wore a simple but elegant gown sewn by her own hands, decorated with the beads Sifo had given her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others turned away, ashamed of their laughter. But Sifo walked straight through the crowd, holding Sumira's hand tightly, and in front of all the same people who once rejected her, he placed a wedding band on her finger. That day, it wasn't just a wedding. It was a quiet rebellion, a love story that defied cruelty, shattered pride, and reminded the whole village that true beauty cannot be burned, mocked, or forgotten. The sun rose brightly on the day of the wedding, casting a golden light over the village of Lumbani. The village square, usually quiet in the early morning, buzzed with noise and excitement. People gathered in large numbers, not to bless the bride, but to witness what they thought would be a dramatic scene. Some came out of sheer curiosity, others out of mockery, whispering among themselves, "Let's see if Sifo finally comes to his senses and cancels this madness." Elders sat in their wooden chairs, shaking their heads, and young girls giggled behind woven fans. No one expected this wedding to happen. Many still believed it was just a joke, something Sifo would abandon once he realized the embarrassment it would bring. But they were all in for a surprise. As the drums began to beat softly, all eyes turned toward the path leading to the village square. From afar, they saw Sifo walking proudly, dressed in regal robes from Demera. His steps were steady, his face calm. He was not a man with doubts. He was a man in love. Right beside him walked Sumira. She looked breathtaking, not because her face was flawless, but because her spirit shone brighter than ever. Her scars were still there, yes, but so was her strength. She wore a beautiful green gown that flowed with every step, made from hand-woven silk, gifted by Sifo. Around her neck, she wore a necklace of gold beads. On her head, a delicate crown of colourful beads sparkled in the sunlight. But what made everyone pause was the way her eyes glowed, calm, confident, and full of life. People stared in silence. The woman they had rejected, mocked, and abandoned now stood like a queen. Some villagers lowered their heads in shame. Others stood frozen, unable to believe what they were seeing. Sifo held her hand tightly as they climbed the decorated wooden stage. A priest from Demera stood ready to bless the union. The ceremony began, and as the sacred chants filled the air, the drums grew louder, echoing across the village. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Sifo took a beaded crown in his hands, placed it gently on Sumira's head, and declared loudly, "You are my queen, not just today, but every day of my life." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some mouths dropped open. Others couldn't stop staring. This wasn't pity. This was love, bold, pure, and fearless. And then, as the chants ended and the drums reached their peak, Sifo turned to Sumira, lifted her veil, and kissed her gently. A hush fell over the crowd. It was not just a kiss. It was a statement to the world, a promise that scars do not define love, a message that beauty is not in skin, but in soul. The crowd remained silent for a moment. Then slowly, some began to clap. A few elders nodded quietly in approval. Even those who had come to laugh found their hearts stirred. Sumira stood beside Sifo, not as a rejected girl, but as a radiant bride. That day, the same village that once threw her away was forced to watch her rise, not in anger or revenge, but in grace, love, and dignity. As the celebrations continued in the village square, just as the drums were still echoing and people were slowly beginning to digest the beautiful truth of Sifo and Sumira's love, a sudden commotion stirred at the village gates. A cloud of dust rose in the distance. From it emerged a procession of regal horsemen, dressed in richly embroidered robes, their horses adorned with royal emblems of the kingdom of Nkoranza. The sound of their hooves grew louder as the crowd turned in confusion and curiosity. The horsemen rode straight into the square, their leader dismounting with great dignity. In his hand, he held a golden scroll, sealed with the royal emblem. The people parted silently, unsure of what was happening. The man stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding as he addressed the elders of Lumbani. "We come on behalf of the Royal Council of Nkoranza," he announced. "We are in search of Sumira, daughter of the late Queen Tabu, rightful heir to the throne of our kingdom." Gasps broke out across the crowd. The elders looked at one another, laughing nervously. This must be some mistake. one of them said. Sumira is just a girl from our village, a girl with a burned face. But the royal messenger paid no attention to their words. Instead, he turned to face Sumira, who stood beside Sifo in her green wedding gown. The guard knelt before her, bowing his head low. Your Highness, we have searched for you for years. After the queen's death, the royal seers revealed that her lost daughter lived far from the palace, hidden in simplicity and sorrow. You are that daughter. You are the true princess of Nkoranza. The entire square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Nobika, who had once thrown Sumira out of her house and called her a disgrace, clutched her chest and collapsed to her knees in shock and shame. Her mouth trembled, her eyes wide with disbelief. The same girl she had treated like a curse was now a royal heir. The villagers looked around in silence, guilt slowly creeping into their hearts. Those who had mocked, whispered, and rejected Sumira could not raise their heads. Their eyes were fixed on the ground, unable to meet her gaze. But Sumira did not look at them with anger or pride. She stood still, graceful and calm, like the true queen she was born to be. Her eyes held no hatred, only quiet strength and dignity. Sifo looked at her and smiled warmly. So, I married a queen indeed, he said with joy in his voice, squeezing her hand gently. Tears welled in Sumira's eyes, not because she was now royalty, but because someone had seen her worth before anyone else did. Sifo had loved her, not for her title, but for her soul. And now, the whole world had no choice but to see her as more than just a girl with scars. She was not only a bride, she was a queen, and her story was only just beginning. Months passed, and the story of Queen Sumira spread far and wide across the land. Songs were sung in her name, and young girls in Nkoranza braided flowers into their hair, hoping to be like the queen who turned pain into power. But Sumira never forgot the village where it all began. One bright morning, golden chariots rolled into Lomani. Trumpets sounded and guards in shining armor cleared the path. The people rushed out, curious and astonished. And there she was, Sumira, their once rejected girl, now dressed in robes woven with threads of gold, wearing a crown that sparkled under the sun. The same villagers who once hid their children from her now bowed their heads in shame. Women who once gossiped behind their hands now clutched their hearts in regret. Men who once mocked her beauty now looked away, unable to face the dignity she carried. But Sumira didn't return for revenge. Her heart held no bitterness. She had come to give, not to take. She stood before the village square and announced that she would build schools, so no child would grow up ignorant. She would build a clinic, so mothers like hers wouldn't suffer without help. She gave food to the hungry, clean water to the poor, and employment to the youth. She turned the land of her pain into a land of hope. Then came Nobika, trembling and frail, no longer the proud woman she once was. She knelt before Sumira, her voice shaking, her eyes filled with tears. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I was blind. I did not see your worth. Please have mercy on me." Sumira looked down at her, not with anger, but with calm strength. She gently helped Nobika to her feet and said, "I forgave you the day I walked away from your doorstep, but may your heart always remember, the beauty you rejected became the crown you now bow to." The words echoed across the square. The villagers, touched by her grace, began to chant her name, not out of pity or guilt, but out of deep respect. But Sumira no longer needed their validation. She had already won, not by fighting, not by shouting, but by rising higher than their hate. Her scars were no longer a burden. They were her strength. They were proof of her journey, her survival, her transformation. Karma had done its work, not with fire or revenge, but by lifting the very one they tried to destroy. Sumira had become a queen not just by blood, but by heart. She had turned her suffering into healing, her pain into purpose, and her rejection into a crown. And as she walked through the village one last time, children followed her, flowers in their hands, singing songs of her story, the story of the girl they once called cursed, who became the queen they now called savior. If this story touched your heart, remember, true beauty lies in the soul, not the skin. Sumira's journey reminds us that no pain is ever wasted, and those who rise with grace will always shine brighter than hate. If you felt the emotion, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Thank you for watching.